The zip tie dug into his wrists before the security guard even finished his sentence. "Sir, we need you to come with us." The man's hand was already on Elliot Dawes' elbow, not gripping, but close enough to make the point. Behind the customer service desk, 2 more guards had materialized from somewhere, flanking the exit like they'd been waiting all morning. Maybe they had been. Elliot didn't move. Not yet. He stood at the returns counter of Hargrove and Weston department store, the flagship location on Michigan Avenue, 5 floors of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and the particular kind of silence that expensive things create. And he set the garment bag down on the counter very slowly, the way a person sets something down when they're deciding whether or not to be angry about it. "What's this about?" he asked. The guard, his name tag read Boone, no first name, looked at him the way certain men look at other men when they've already decided the answer before the question is asked. "We have reason to believe you've been concealing merchandise." The woman behind the counter, a pale-haired girl in her early 20s, whose mascara was slightly smudged at the left corner, looked away. She'd been the one to call them. Elliot had watched her pick up the phone. He was 31 years old. He was wearing a gray Henley, dark jeans, and a pair of work boots that had seen better days. He had walked in 11 minutes ago, carrying a garment bag containing a suit. His suit, the one he'd purchased 4 months earlier for his sister's wedding, and he had intended to return it because the lining had separated from the jacket at the left shoulder seam. He had the receipt. He had the tags. He had driven 40 minutes from Calumet City because this was the only Hargrove and Weston that processed returns for the brand. None of that, apparently, mattered. "I'm not concealing anything," he said. "I'm making a return." Boone looked at the garment bag. "We'll need to open that." "It's a suit. We'll need to verify that." Elliot looked at him for a moment. The store around them had gone quiet in that particular way. Public spaces go quiet when something is happening that everyone can see, but no one wants to acknowledge. A woman with a stroller had stopped near the handbag display. A man in a suit, a customer, not staff, had turned toward them with the practiced disinterest of someone who was, in fact, very interested. Elliot unzipped the garment bag. He did it slowly, deliberately, the same way he'd entered his PIN number at the kiosk. The same way he'd done everything this morning, because he'd known, the moment he walked through those doors and felt the shift in the air, that he was going to need to be careful. He'd known it the way he always knew it, the way every black man he'd grown up with knew it, the kind of knowing that lives in the body before the mind has time to name it. Inside the bag was the suit, navy blue, single-breasted, a Whitmore and Crane, which was a brand that cost what it cost, and that Elliot had spent 3 months' savings on, because his sister Renata had asked him to be in the wedding party, and he'd wanted to do it right. The lining damage was visible even from the outside, a pucker at the left shoulder, the silk pulling away from the wool, a small but obvious flaw. Also in the bag, tucked into the inner breast pocket, the receipt, the original tags, a printed email from Hargrove and Weston's customer service, confirming that the return was eligible under the manufacturer's defect policy. Boone stared at the suit, then at Elliot. "We're still going to need you to come to the back," he said. "Why?" "Standard procedure." Elliot looked at him. "For a return? For a situation like this?" And there it was, a situation like this. Elliot thought about asking him to define that. He thought about a lot of things in the 2 seconds that followed. About his sister's wedding, about the drive over, about the coffee he hadn't had time to finish that morning, about the fact that he had a meeting in 3 hours and had planned to be back well before noon. He thought about his mother, who had told him once, when he was maybe 14 and already learning the particular calculus of these moments, "You don't have to swallow it, baby, but you do have to decide what it costs you." He thought about what it cost him. "Fine," he said. He picked up the garment bag. "I'd like to speak to your manager first." Boone's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. He hadn't expected that. Most people, Elliot had noticed, didn't say that. Most people either escalated or they folded. The ones who folded got treated the way people expected them to be treated. The ones who escalated got treated like problems. Elliot was neither. He was just going to ask for the manager. The back office of a department store is one of the more dismal environments a person can find themselves in involuntarily. Elliot had been in a few, not in circumstances like this, but in his years before this, in the years when he'd been doing security assessments for retail chains, walking their floors, learning how their systems worked. He knew what loss prevention looked like from the inside. He knew how the cameras were positioned, how the algorithms flagged behavior, how a judgment call got made before anyone with actual authority was in the room. This one had a folding table, 3 plastic chairs, a monitor showing a frozen frame from the store's CCTV, and a smell of old coffee and new carpet that was somehow both oppressive and forgettable. Boone stood near the door. A second guard, younger, with the slightly apologetic posture of someone who wasn't entirely sure they were on the right side of this, stood near the corner. Elliot sat in the chair they'd gestured him toward and put the garment bag across his knees. He waited. 4 minutes later, the manager arrived. Her name, she said, was Renata, not his sister, just an unfortunate coincidence that he filed away and ignored. Renata Voss, assistant store director. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a blazer that had been pressed that morning, and she had the particular expression of someone who had been told one version of a story before she walked in the door, and was now rapidly recalculating. She looked at Elliot. She looked at the garment bag. She looked at Boone. "Can I see the receipt?" she said. Elliot handed it to her. She read it. She read the confirmation email. She examined the suit, held it up, turned it in the light, found the lining damage without being told where to look. The silence in the room changed. "Mr. Daw," she said, and her voice had shifted into something that wasn't quite apologetic but was moving in that direction. "I want to make sure I understand what happened here. I came to make a return," Elliot said. "I was told I was concealing merchandise. I was brought back here." She glanced at Boone. Boone said, "We had reason to believe." "What reason?" Elliot asked. Not loud, just even. The kind of even that takes practice. Boone didn't answer immediately, and in that gap, something happened that Elliot had not expected. The second guard, the younger one in the corner, looked down at his shoes. What Elliot Daw had not told them, what he would not tell them, not yet, not unless he had to, was what he did for work. He'd left the security assessment business 4 years ago. What he did now was different. He'd spent 8 years as a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, though not the one on television. The real one, which was less dramatic and far more precise. He'd worked financial crimes, organized theft networks, insurance fraud on a scale that made a department store's loss prevention team look like a lemonade stand. He'd written protocols. He'd trained people. He'd testified in federal court 17 times. He'd left that too, 6 months ago, for reasons that were his own, and that he didn't owe anyone an explanation for. But he'd left with a commendation from the deputy director, a civilian service medal, and a letter that had been signed by 3 people whose names appeared in news briefings. All of it was in the car. He didn't carry his credentials anymore. That wasn't who he was now, he'd decided. He was just a person making a return on a Wednesday morning, which was a thing any person should be allowed to do without being followed into a back room. But Renata Voss was still looking at him in that particular way, recalculating, recalibrating. And he could see her trying to figure out who he was. Not because she had access to any of that history, but because there was something in the way he sat in the chair, the way he'd handed her the receipt, the way he'd said what reason without raising his voice, that didn't fit the story she'd been handed. "Mr. Daw," she said again, slower this time, "I owe you an apology." Elliot looked at her. "This should not have happened," she said. "Your return is valid. The merchandise defect is visible. You had documentation." She paused. "I don't have a good explanation for why our team escalated this the way they did." Boone, near the door, said nothing. The younger guard was still looking at his shoes. "I'd like to process your return now," Voss said, "and I'd like to offer you—" "I don't need anything," Elliot said. "I'd like my refund and I'd like to go." She nodded, and that should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because of what happened next, which Elliot hadn't expected and which changed the nature of everything. As he stood up from the plastic chair, the younger guard spoke. "I want to say something." His voice was unsteady. He was maybe 25, light-haired, with the look of someone who'd taken this job because it was available and hadn't yet figured out what that meant. I didn't think this was right. When we were called, I said so." Boone turned to look at him. "I told Marcus," he gestured toward Boone, "that the customer had documentation, that he was at the returns counter, that there wasn't any reason to." He stopped, swallowed. "I said so. I want it on record that I said so." The room was very quiet. Elliot looked at him. The young man's name tag said Cole, and he had the particular expression of someone who had just done something that would cost him something, and had done it anyway. "What's your name?" Elliot asked. "Darian," he said. "Darian Cole." Elliot nodded once. Not warmly, he wasn't there yet. But he nodded. The refund took 9 minutes. Renata Voss processed it herself, at the main register, which Elliot understood was a gesture. Public, visible, the kind of correction that could be witnessed. He accepted it without comment. He put his phone in his pocket. He picked up the empty garment bag. He was at the door when she caught up to him. Mr. Daw. She wasn't out of breath, but she'd moved quickly. I want you to know, this isn't. I don't want you to think this is how we operate. He looked at her for a moment. She was sincere. He could tell the difference, after years of reading people for a living, between someone performing contrition and someone genuinely arriving at it. She was genuinely arriving at it. That didn't fix anything, but it was something. Miss Voss, he said, I've been in this store 3 times. This is the first time I brought documentation. She looked at him. You want to know why I brought documentation today? He didn't wait for her answer, because the last 2 times I didn't. And the last 2 times something like this almost happened. He paused. I want you to sit with that. He left. The drive back to Calumet City took 47 minutes because of construction on the 94, and Elliot spent most of it not thinking about the store. He thought about the drive over earlier. Before all of this, the coffee he'd left on the kitchen counter, still hot probably cold now. He thought about his sister's wedding, which had been beautiful, which had been exactly what she'd wanted, which he'd stood in the front of the room, for in the suit that was now a receipt in his phone. He thought about Darian Cole, standing in the corner of that room, looking at his shoes. He thought about what it cost a person to say, I said so in a room where no one wanted to hear it. He thought about his mother. What Elliot didn't know yet, couldn't know, driving south on the 94 with the radio off, was that Renata Voss had gone back into the office. She'd closed the door. She'd sat down across from Boone and asked him, very quietly, to walk her through the decision-making. Not in an accusatory way, in the way of someone who needed to understand something in order to decide what to do next. Boone had walked her through it, and as he did, the logic he'd used, the situational factors, the behavioral indicators, the standard protocol, had not held up to the telling. He'd heard it himself. She'd watched him hear it. She'd asked Darian Cole to put his account in writing before the end of his shift. She'd contacted HR. She'd also done something that she would not have known to do if Elliot hadn't said what he said on the way out. She'd pulled the security footage from Elliot's previous 2 visits. She'd found both incidents. In one, a guard had followed Elliot through the menswear section for 11 minutes. In another, he'd been asked for proof of purchase on an item he was actively still shopping for, still holding, hadn't yet carried to the register. She'd found that, and she'd felt something that wasn't quite shame but lived in the same neighborhood. She didn't know Elliot's history. She didn't know about NCIS or the federal court or the commendation or any of it. She hadn't needed to. That was the thing that surprised her most later when she thought about it. She hadn't needed to know who he was. The documentation had been sufficient. The ordinary facts of the transaction had been sufficient. The answer had been obvious from the moment she walked in the door. She'd just been the only one willing to look at it directly. 3 weeks later, Elliot received a letter. Physical, on paper, in an envelope, which was unusual enough that he opened it carefully. It was from Hargrove and Weston's corporate office. It was addressed to him by name. It described the internal review that had been conducted following his visit, the disciplinary actions that had been taken. It did not specify against whom, and a revised protocol for the returns department that had been implemented company-wide. It described a new training program for loss prevention staff. It thanked him, with language that was formal but not hollow, for his patience and for his final words to the assistant store director, which, the letter noted, had directly precipitated the review. At the bottom, there was a handwritten note. The handwriting was careful, unhurried. Mr. Daw, I watched the footage, both times. I'm sorry it took this long. R. Voss Elliot read the letter twice. Then he set it on the kitchen table next to his coffee. He thought about Darian Cole, who had spoken up in a room where speaking up was the harder thing to do. He wondered what had happened to him, whether he was still working there, whether saying I said so had cost him the job he'd been uncertain about, whether the thing he'd done had been worth what it had cost him. He found out 2 weeks after that, through a contact he hadn't intended to use for anything personal. Darian Cole had been promoted. Not dramatically, a shift lead position, a small raise, a new set of responsibilities, but promoted, kept. The store had chosen, in the end, to reward the thing that Darian had done rather than punish it. Elliot found that he was glad about this in a way that was quieter and more complicated than he'd expected. Not relieved, not satisfied. Just glad. The way you're glad when something small goes right in a world where most things don't. He hadn't told anyone about what had happened in that store. Not his sister, not his mother, not the 2 or 3 people he'd have called friends if pressed. He wasn't sure why. Partly because telling it would require explaining it, and explaining it would require a particular kind of patience that he didn't always have. Partly because stories like this, the kind that ended in letters and revised protocols and small promotions, were rare enough that he wasn't sure people would believe it had ended that way. Most didn't. Partly because he was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the store, and everything to do with the accumulation of moments like it. The drive over, the knowing in his body before his mind could name it. The careful way he'd unzipped the bag, the documentation he'd brought because the last 2 times he hadn't. He was tired of needing to be ready. He was tired of the calculus. He was tired of his mother's voice in his head saying, "You don't have to swallow it, baby, but you do have to decide what it costs you." Because he loved her, and because she was right, and because the fact that she had needed to say it to him when he was 14 was its own kind of exhausting. He kept the letter. He filed it in a folder in the drawer, where he kept his federal service records and his commendation, and the printed email confirmation from Hargrove and Weston's customer service that he'd carried into the store that morning and come home with, unused, because the documentation he'd needed had been visible in the suit itself. The morning after the letter arrived, he called his sister. Not about the store. She didn't know about the store. He called her because he'd been meaning to. Because she'd sent him a photo from her honeymoon that he'd been meaning to respond to for 3 weeks. Because she was his sister, and he loved her. And sometimes that was reason enough. "How are you?" she asked, which was what she always asked first, and which she meant in the particular way that people who know you well mean it when they ask it. Not "how are you performing" or "how are things going," but "how are you," specifically, the person I know. "I'm okay," he said. And then, because she was his sister and he loved her, and sometimes that was reason enough, "I had a hard few weeks." "You want to talk about it?" "Not really," he said. "Maybe later." "Okay," she said, "later then." They talked about other things, her new apartment, a TV show she'd started, the fact that their mother had gotten a dog, which neither of them had expected, but which, she reported, their mother was completely besotted with. Elliot sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and listened to his sister's voice and felt the specific, ordinary comfort of being known by someone. Not known for what he'd done or who he'd been or what was in a folder in his drawer. Just known, just himself at the table with the coffee on an ordinary morning. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in early November, the kind of cold that isn't brutal yet but means business, the light, flat, and honest, and a little gray. He'd go for a walk later. He'd been walking more these past months, since he'd left the service, learning what it felt like to move through a place without assessing it. He wasn't entirely sure he knew how to do that yet, but he was learning. The letter was in the drawer. Darian Cole was a shift lead. Renata Voss had watched the footage. The suit was returned. The lining damage documented. The refund processed. None of it undid anything, but some of it mattered. Some things do, even the small ones. Even the ones that arrive 3 weeks late in a physical envelope on paper, in handwriting that is careful and unhurried. He'd learned that. It had taken a long time. He was still learning it. The coffee was good. His sister was laughing at something she'd just remembered. The dog apparently had learned to open the refrigerator. He stayed on the phone.